All right, I think we're all here together. Hello, welcome, good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Small. I'm an organizer with World Beyond War. Really honored to be hosting this space tonight to launch a new phase of the Scotiabank Funds Genocide campaign. Yeah, I can't believe I have to introduce this webinar like in this context again, this moment of renewed and somehow ever more horrifying, escalating horror. I think all of us probably are here tonight because we have been watching over the past week the absolutely unbearable violence. Hundreds of Palestinians being killed every single day in the past week. We've all been watching, I think, as children, as adults, as elders, as people of all ages are being deliberately starved en masse. And I was thinking before opening this webinar about how, really nothing that we can do is enough. And in some ways, Gaza can feel so far away from here and from what we can do here. But of course, when we look around us, and I think many of us are joining here from so-called Canada, when we look around us here, we see the threads of complicity, right? We see the support for the Israeli military, the Zionist government, the connection from here to these bombs that are falling on tents. And it's really nice to see many of your faces when I look around at this call. I'm seeing people who want to unravel those threads, who want to do everything we can to end this genocide and have been doing so much every single day over the past year and a half, in some cases over decades. And tonight's call is about this, right? It's about us organizing together to try to unravel one of those threads, to take collective action, to come together in power, to cut off a key funding source for Israel's biggest weapons company, Elbit Systems. As we know, Elbit's drones and bombs and weapon systems are massacring Palestinians across Gaza right now. So tonight, we come together to build the campaign to force Scotiabank, one of Elbit's top investors in the world, to divest. I'm really so honored to be here with you, all of you tonight, to take on this one piece of the puzzle, really to work bit by bit by bit to do what we can to shut down the Israeli war machine. It's not enough, but I think that's what we can do. And it's just really meaningful for me to be together with all of you tonight. We've got some incredible speakers tonight, and then we're going to be, as I mentioned, launching the next phase of this campaign and digging into what is the action that we can take together, the first next step together in June. But first, I'm really so pleased to introduce our first speaker. Tarek Loubani is a Palestinian-Canadian emergency physician and director of Glia, a medical solidarity organization operating in Gaza. I think I first connected with Tarek after he was shot in both legs by Israeli soldiers while treating Palestinians injured during the Great March of Return a few years ago. And then I also had the pleasure of organizing with Tarek in London, Ontario, where more recently he was arrested in connection with allegedly some ketchup that may have looked like blood that was pressuring local MPs to take action. I think Tarek is a real treasure of our movements, and I'm just so glad to be introducing you tonight. Welcome, Tarek.
Thank you so much. And there's no allegedly on the ketchup the second time around. The first time it was allegedly. The second time I definitely did it. And we're fighting a constitutional challenge on it. So yes, more on that in the coming months and years. I want to talk about the medical situation in Gaza right now, what's happening, and what we can look forward to in the coming probably couple of months. To kind of orient you, I'm an emergency physician. I work with an organization called Glia. And Glia, for people who kind of knew it before 2 years ago, was a medical device company that was working on gaining national sovereignty in places like Palestine, lots of other places too, through open source medical devices. Our purpose always was to make it so people could depend on themselves when they were trying to take care of their patients. Subsequently, once the war started in Gaza, we had to shift to emergency response. And we've always looked at it as wanting to minimize the amount that we're doing for emergency response and maximize the amount that we're doing for infrastructure building. But this is a moment where I think we all feel that we have to shift so many of our resources to emergency response, and our organization was no different. So we've been putting in delegations. When we first started, the delegations were going in to provide medical care. And we thought that that was what we needed to do. And in fact, we didn't really select particularly for any characteristic other than this is a good doctor. What we realized very quickly, though, is that the doctors were basically, and the medical teams, there's also logistics in there, basically the only people going in. And so they had to serve multiple roles that usually the medical system is very poor at serving. For example, we had to become witnesses, we had to become advocates. And this is in no way to diminish the ability and the talent of Palestinians who are witnessing themselves what's going on and broadcasting that, who are advocating themselves and really making lots of moves for their own liberation. However, it it was one of our acts of solidarity. We no longer considered ourselves or looked at ourselves as medical aid, which was kind of the first incarnation of how we perceived ourselves, and started looking at ourselves as medical solidarity. So the reason why I give that background is because fundamentally, all that any of us can do from the outside is solidarity. We can't think of this as aid. We can't think of this as, us doing something for the Palestinians, but rather us doing something with the Palestinians. They lead, we follow. That's what solidarity means. In terms of what the situation looks like on the ground right now, so there were, I guess I'll talk about the history a little bit. Basically, the Palestinians have developed a remarkable medical system in Gaza. And it was, of course, a terrible thing to cut Gaza off from the rest of the world starting in 2005, 2006. At the same time, it provided Palestinians with an opportunity to seriously contend with what it looks like to have an independent medical system that didn't rely on everybody else. And so, whereas most doctors in, let's say, our parents' generation had trained outside, most doctors in my generation and younger in Palestine have trained inside Palestine. And when I got there, there was the genesis. Already medical students were being trained there, but there was the genesis of boards, that is to say, specialties and subspecialties. The Palestinians created a medical system that didn't rely in terms of personnel on people from the outside. And it didn't rely in terms of training on people from the outside. And that's why we see that for all the problems we have in Gaza right now, we're not seeing really a shortage of doctors. Yes, they're burnt out. Yes, they're constantly getting killed, arrested, so on. However, there's an abundance. I mean, abundance is probably the wrong word, but there's sufficient number of doctors. The doctors is not the problem. Same with the nurses, same with allied health like physiotherapists, paramedics, etc. The second thing is the equipment. And that's one of the things that we've always had problems with in Gaza. There has never been enough equipment. There has never been enough medications. We don't even wonder about what medications are short. We talk about what medications are zero availability, what's called stock out. In before October 7th, that number was 45% of essential medications. So there's an essential medication list that's developed by the World Health Organization. 45% of it at any given point in time was stocked out, and that is to say zero stock. And you could bet that anything that made life easier or more tolerable was always stocked out. So for example, I've been going there for 15 years. I never once saw morphine there or any of these kinds of narcotic drugs. There was some tramadol pills that were around, but generally they were smuggled in. When I was shot, Rachel talked about me being shot. I was offered Advil, like tablets of Advil. And that was because I was a doctor. That wasn't something that was routinely offered to all patients. It was because I was their colleague. The stockout since then is almost 100%. Like we are talking about massive stockouts of equipment, of medications, of any basic supplies. And we kind of know this. Like in 2014, we ran out of gauze during the war, um, which is a tad bit ironic because the word gauze is from the word Gaza, because Gaza used to be the place where the Romans used to weave their gauze. It's a special weave back in the day. So it was particularly poignant that that was the one thing that we totally stocked out on in 2014. But now, I mean, forget about gauze. People are using torn up shirts. Forget about gloves. If they're not coming in with delegates, they're not coming in. Forget about water, soap. I mean, everything is stocked out. You can't really imagine what it's like to practice medicine. Like, think of all of the basics that your doctor would want. For example, the other day I was in a patient room and I dropped a pair of tweezers on the table in front of me. And the patient was like, I don't want you to use that on me. It's too dirty. And I couldn't help but kind of reflect on the fact that, like, isn't that interesting? That over there, like, nobody would ever imagine that that was a dirty implement. And in fact, so often I would sew people up with rusted out equipment because the autoclaves use salty water. So we kind of come to the last important piece, which is the infrastructure. We always had infrastructure attacks. In 2014, there were 60 medical institutions or establishments that were attacked. This was always a problem. However, what we're seeing now is so exceptional in that it appears the war is specifically targeting the medical system. And there's lots of speculation about this. My colleagues say, well, they're not able to make any achievements on the military targets. And so their achievements are all of the hospital targets. And, if any of you kind of follow the Electronic Intifada live streams, which I'm guessing probably gets a good audience among this crowd, during one of the updates, John Elmer had been one of the military analysts, had been talking about how an outgoing unit of people, a commander, was credited publicly with the 9 hospitals that he destroyed during his tenure leading this particular brigade. So right now, at this exact moment, we are seeing a clear, directed, and targeted attack of hospitals. Now, this is extraordinary because we've seen the attacks on hospitals the entire 18 months, and still everybody on the ground is saying this is different. What they're doing to the hospitals over the past week is different, and that they are being considered, not just targets to attack, but rather places that have to be completely destroyed. Think about it like this. Right now, the Israelis put out some trial balloons. Oh, well, we're going to assassinate this guy. We're going to assassinate that guy. Nobody said anything. Nobody really protested. And so they started wiping out buildings. So, for example, they took out an empty building at Nasser that had been evacuated because it was, people wondered if this building was going to be targeted based on what the Israelis had been saying. Um, I'm sure half of you haven't even heard about that particular building going down in Nasser. Once that gets established as a norm, as a normal behavior, then what happens next? I worked in Ukraine and there was bombing at one of the hospitals. I was at one of the frontline hospitals on the southeastern front. And one of the hospitals had some rockets hit probably, I would say, a kilometer away. And let me tell you, it was mayhem in terms of every organization falling over themselves to condemn the Russians for doing that. And fantastic. That's great. I love that. I don't hold that against the Ukrainians for seeking condemnation for that. At the same time, why aren't those same organizations, those same communities condemning it here too? So I'll wrap up very quickly with one comment. Rachel had said that nothing that we're doing or that we can do is enough. I think that's true, but I think that we have to extend that thinking because sometimes that kind of thought can be demobilizing and it shouldn't be demobilizing. Okay, fine. You and I, we're not going to be able to end this war. However, just like there's military attrition. For example, imagine that there's a Palestinian resistance fighter who gets up and blows up a tank. Is the war over? No. But does that fighter have an existential crisis about his utility in the overall struggle? No, because that fighter understands that there's military attrition. The Yemenis taught us that there's such a thing as economic attrition. And what we're seeing is this incredibly impactful way that that the Yemenis and other organizations and groups have contributed to serious economic problems. However, none of us talk about or think about political attrition. All of our actions, firstly, I mean, the Scotiabank campaign has had successes. The money has been scaled back at some point. Now obviously we're reinitiating, but that was successful. There are things that we can do. Our impact, the way we vote, the way we talk to our politicians, the way we protest, the ketchup that gets smeared on their doors, none of these things end the war. Every one of these actions is a step forward towards what we do. So at these moments, I want you not to fall for the propaganda that your actions are meaningless. Even though it's complex, every one of us individually is kind of meaningless, but every one of us is a component of the thing that is so meaningful. Like one of the commenters had talked about how, we're drops in an ocean. The ocean is all drops. And so I think that we have to look at ourselves as being a part of that. For us medically, we do what we can. If you're a doctor, please reach out. If you're a healthcare provider, please reach out. If you are able to stay in Gaza for prolonged periods to do logistics, please reach out. And if you're not, well, I mean, there are a million other ways to ensure that we're doing the most we can for liberation of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tarek. I think that so much of what you shared is, well, first of all, is obviously resonating with everyone else based on the comments, but also with me. And I mean, I think that for those of us who are really all caught up in the weapons and the investments and this, it's so important to take a moment to be grounded in what is actually happening on the ground. What do the use of Elbit weapons actually mean in terms of the healthcare system on the ground there? But also, what does our resistance mean? And what is the bigger picture that we fit into? And what does being that drop in the ocean look like? So anyways, thank you very much for everything that you do and for what you shared just now. I should mention that we will be doing a Q&A period at the end, so we will kind of gather questions as they come up in the chat and also give a chance for folks to share it at the end, but we won't do it individually after each speaker. Next, I'm really thrilled to introduce Dov Baum, who is a director of AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee's Action Center for Corporate Accountability. She's also a co-founder of Who Profits from the Occupation. I will say personally that her work building the AFSC's index of companies that are profiting from the war on Gaza and tracking those weapons exports has been 100% invaluable to the Arms Embargo Now campaign in Canada and all of our work tracking what Canadian weapons companies are doing it. We couldn't do it without the research that her and her colleagues are doing, and I'm just thrilled to have you here today. Welcome, Dov.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm honored to speak after Dr. Loubani, so I'm excited to be here. I'm going to tell you some things you probably already heard. I hope it is going to be helpful, and also I'm going to share some websites, and I'll put the links later in the chat for you all to have, so don't worry about that. So I'm going to talk for a moment about Elbit and about what people have done around the world against Elbit. So Elbit Systems is Israel's largest weapons manufacturer, and it is also one of the primary suppliers of the Israeli military. So if we are talking about war crimes and about what Israel is doing to people in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Syria, in Lebanon, Elbit is deeply implicated in all of those. So some points about that. First of all, there are some new weapon systems that they are now developing. They are developing new cannons, new howitzer automated cannons. They are part of the F-35 supply chain for this huge project that involves thousands of producers around the world. They make the helmets, the smart helmets. They do a lot of command and control centers for states. Part of the Israeli apartheid wall is surveilled by Elbit Systems, but also the US-Mexico border has Elbit systems all in two of its main sections. Let me share some websites. Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. So this is one of our pages, the companies profiting from the Gaza genocide. You can see a lot of companies and their specific involvement, including Elbit Systems here. And here we try to track whenever we know that any war crime is specifically connected to a specific weapon system. So that can be useful. Another resource we have is the Investigate database, investigate.info. That is a full database of publicly traded companies involved in Israeli apartheid, genocide, and occupation. So it's not just about attacks in Gaza. And here, each company has its own profile. You can read more about Elbit and everything we know about Elbit, but you can also scan investments or look for funds and see what they're invested in, or look for other companies. So this is our main tool. Going into Elbit Systems, they are quite proud of their achievements over the last couple of years. So I want to share with you some of those with their specific involvement in the war around the Middle East, and specifically in the genocide in Gaza. So first and foremost, they are the main provider of large drones to the Israeli military. The Hermes 450 and the Hermes 900. And if you remember the attack last year on the World Central Kitchen aid workers in Gaza, this was proven to be done by one of their drones, the Hermes 450, but there are, of course, many hundreds of such attacks. It's sometimes hard to connect them to specific weapon systems. They also provide the Israeli military with a lot of munitions and bombs. And this is a very important bottleneck for the genocide. Over the last, how long has it been now? 17 months? No, more than that. It's already 19, yes? 18 months. Oh, it's 19 months. I'm really kind of tired of it, like all of us. We have seen how Israel was actually forced to sign short agreements to pause the bombings, and many times this had to do with shortage of munitions, specifically 155 millimeter shells for artillery and 120 millimeter shells for tanks. There is a world shortage of these munitions, which is really bad news, and that is because of the war in the Ukraine. As well as the attacks on Gaza, and so much so that there weren't enough shells for supply to Pakistan when they wanted it. So much so that Israel had to cut back supplies to some of its European clients because they needed that for their own campaigns. And so developing more of an internal production system by Elbit Systems for the Israeli military became a priority because of the amount of shells that they were using, the huge volume of shelling that they were using. They had to increase the production. The same is true with the big bombs. I don't know if you remember, but the Biden administration, despite providing Israel with everything that they might need, one of their last actions of this administration was actually to block the supply of the 1-ton bombs, the large bombs to Israel, as well as some Caterpillar bulldozers, because these tools are directly related to very explicit war crimes of destroying entire cities upon their inhabitants. And they were blocked by the Biden administration, later on released by the Trump administration. But At that moment, when Israel wanted those bombs and needed those bombs in order to create more destruction, that created a bit of a worry. And that is why Elbit Systems is now building a new factory for these huge bombs to specifically use them on urban areas. So another last piece of news is that Elbit Systems has a new contract to supply the Israeli military with the smallest drones, the ones called quadcopters. Israel has bought these drones from different manufacturers during the genocide. A lot of them were Chinese, but now they also want their own internal reliance on sustainable supply from Elbit Systems. I don't know if I need to tell you some of the horrific stories about these quadcopters that are flying around everywhere on the West Bank as well as Gaza. Multiple accounts of how they are used to kill individuals from very short range, just to, appear out of nowhere and kill people, and also draw people by sounding sounds that can draw people to them, like sounds of people calling for help, and then they are being bombed, and also used for, of course, for surveillance. So these are horrific stories, and this is what Elbit does. Let's see another thing. This is the Elbit's first quarter report for 2025 to its investors. They are doing quite well. So here is where you can read a lot of what they're doing, but the main thing is this graph here on the right. You can see the revenues. New business is kind of soaring up starting in 2022. NATO countries have increased their military budgets, the war in the Ukraine, and then the attacks on Gaza. Revenues did not grow as quickly. It took them a moment, but they do report that in the first quarter of 2025, revenues went up 22%. 22% in one quarter, and this is the third quarter in a row when they had this huge growth. So war is profitable, and Elbit has become a lot more profitable. If I skip to talking about Scotiabank, which is why we're here, I want to just make the connection between those graphs and what we know about the bank's investment. So the first we learned about Scotiabank's investment in Elbit was in 2019, thanks to this bank manager, David Fingold, who actually bragged about his investment, which is disproportionate investment in two Israeli companies, Strauss and Elbit Systems. He was bragging about it. I think he probably did it out of his own political, ideological commitments. And thanks to your campaign, the bank started divesting. We can see news about divesting already starting in 2023, from owning over 5% of Elbit Systems and being one of the largest shareholders in Elbit Systems. In fact, one of the 5 largest shareholders. The bank's holdings in Elbit dropped to 4.2% in the end of 23, and then March 24, 2.5%, 144%, and in September 24, down to 125%. That's a huge drop. It's a drop from 2.23 million shares to something like 500,000 shares. That is serious divestment. So much so that this is the Israeli financial press. The Israeli financial press, this person is the CEO of Elbit Systems. The Israeli financial press is celebrating early this year the good results and the growth in the worth of Elbit Systems, despite the divestment from the Bank of Nova Scotia. And if we go into the graphs, this is just a graph from today. I just took it from today. You can see something really weird going on here. That's the price of Elbit shares. You can see it is soaring. Yes, now it is soaring. Of course it is soaring. especially since kind of the last quarter of 2024. But the war started before that, yes? It started in the end of 2023. And from the end of 2023 until the end of 2024, the price did not change. And that is despite growth in sales that you saw in the previous graph. They were selling more than twice to the Israeli military, and growth of demand from Europe. Their share price didn't go up. That is a result of the Nova Scotia divestment. It is a direct result of that. Now, you might think that's not much to expect, but I would say for a company such as Elbit, this is huge. And for other companies around it, this is a very strong sign that one bank selling some of their shares can have this much of an effect on a big company like that. Just last few words, I wanted to add that this is, of course, a global campaign, the arms embargo on Israel, which also includes buying weapons. And Elbit Systems, of course, is a big exporter of weapon systems to all over the world. And starting with Palestine Action in the UK, that did a lot of direct action, and some of them paid a high price for it as well. And managed to close down one of Elbit Systems' factories, going into states that announced not buying Israeli weapons and not providing weapons to Israel, such as Spain or the UK. We keep having work even in those countries. This is a recent achievement when activists found out that despite the commitment to an arms embargo on Israel, Spain was about to buy a bunch of munitions from the company, and that was blocked last minute, all the way to other divestment. And this is another one of our websites that I want to recommend, and it's my last one. It is afsc.org/divest. You can find a lot of information here, but I just want to direct you to the last section where we are tracking divestment achievements over the last few months. And there are many such achievements. And I'm not even sure that this list is a complete list. We try to keep it as complete as possible. We see cities all around the world, and we work directly with activists that are running divestment campaigns in cities and counties and even state pension funds in the US. One after the other, divesting, universities, divesting from weapons companies, divesting from all the weapon industries. We just heard of MIT dropping Elbit Systems from its industrial liaison program, which is another achievement of the student movement in the United States. We see many places where activists demand divestment from anything to do with Israeli apartheid, genocide, and occupation, and they reach some kind of a compromise with institutions that just agree to divest from all arms and military assistance, including, of course, Elbit and other weapon systems. So you can just go over this list and just rejoice of all these small victories, because just like Dr. Loubani said, the ocean is made of drops, and these are some big drops that we can learn from.
Thank you so much, Dov. Your work, truly has been such a necessary piece of so many struggles to divest, to block the weapons. Like, we have to have the information first, and the work that you do to provide that research to the world has just been humongous. I really appreciated how you put what we're doing here in a broader context. And I mean, in terms of the Elbit piece, bringing in the context of pushing for an arms embargo, and I imagine many of the people in this call are also connected to the Arms Embargo Now campaign in Canada, and the ways that we're often using the language of a two-way arms embargo, because we're trying to stress that not only are Canadian companies providing parts for Elbit weapon systems that are being shipped to Israel, amongst many other weapon systems, we're also buying Elbit weaponry. The Canadian military is buying it as well. So it's exporting and importing in support of Elbit and other Israeli weapons companies. That's a really important piece of the puzzle. And the work that we're doing today to look at how can we cut off the flow of funds to Elbit is a complementary piece. And altogether, these things are of big relevance to Elbit. And as Dov showed, I mean, if it's showing up in quotes from Elbit CEOs in Israeli papers, that is the tip of the iceberg of the concern that these companies have about the impacts of what we're doing. Thank you for that reminder. Yeah, and I think that like bridges really nicely into what we should turn to now. So I mean, this people, I want to give a shout out really to thousands of people across the country over years, and then especially in the past year and a half, who have really been noting the huge investment role that Scotiabank plays in Elbit. Of course, if you look at the investments of all the Canadian banks, yes, they're all invested in the weapons industry. Yes, they all have connections to Israeli apartheid and Israeli military violence. But Scotiabank's investment in Elbit is truly unique and is huge and is very, very relevant to that company's bottom line. And recognizing that has really led to incredible mobilizing over this country over the past year and a half. The Canada-Palestinian Association has been doing Scotiabank targeting actions since last October. Jews Say No to Genocide, a group I'm involved in, one of our very, very first big actions that we did in November 2023, completely shut down the Scotiabank headquarter building in Toronto with a big occupation of it. And really this campaign that we're all here to launch a new phase of tonight is coming together as this cross-national solidarity campaign, bringing folks together across the country who have been involved in various forms in targeting Scotiabank over the past year and a half. And under the name Scotiabank Funds Genocide, there have been unified protests at dozens of Scotiabank branches over the past year. Palestinian youth movement has led really powerful protests there. I can't even name kind of all the targeting of Scotiabank that's happened over the past year and a half. But it's been really powerful. And as Dov alluded to, has had huge successes on a number of different fronts, one of which was a huge divestment of Scotiabank in Elbit. But it's because that trend is changing now that we're kind of remobilizing now. But first, I really want to bring up someone to speak to some of those really big wins and a really awesome angle of that organizing against Scotiabank that's happened in the past year and a half. So I'm really happy to introduce Michael Deforge. He's an award-winning Canadian comics artist, illustrator, and author, and he's an organizer with No Arms in the Arts. I should mention that Jody Chan, who's also with No Arms in the Arts, was supposed to speak tonight, but unfortunately was unable to do so. But we're really thrilled to have Michael here in her place. If you have seen any lefty magazine in Canada, if you've seen a protest poster that caught your eye, it was probably designed by Michael. His art is everywhere and is of like huge service to social movements and lefty grassroots building across the country. And the work that No Arms in the Arts has done over the past year and a half targeting Scotia has been, I think, a real example to folks all across the country. So anyways, thank you so much for joining us, Michael, and can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. And let me see if I can share my screen. I think this is working. Okay. Yeah, so No Arms in the Arts. We have been, one of the many different campaigns organizing against Scotiabank. They're not the only sort of target of our organizing. We've also taken on Indigo and the Israeli Foundation, but Scotiabank has dominated quite a bit of our organizing, as you'll see. We are a coalition that includes a number of different culture sector orgs. So that includes Writers Against the War on Gaza, which I'm in, Canlit Responds, Filmworkers for Palestine, Artists Against Art Washing, and then also just a number of other unaffiliated artists and organizers and art workers in multiple industries. The, I guess, inciting event um, for the culture sector taking on Scotiabank in a very big way was before No Arms was even a campaign, and this was the 2023 Giller Prize Gala, and it was a televised. You're all in Canada, you've probably like seen this, but for those who might not know, is a big televised book award, and while Rick Mercer was on stage, people disrupted it, and to protest Scotiabank, there were arrests made. There's still one pending charge from that arrest, notably, like 18 months later, and the resulting press was one of the first times the mainstream press was really writing about Scotiabank's investment in Elbit, because unlike a lot of other actions around Scotiabank or just in solidarity with Palestine in general, media coverage tends to default to just like protest, like they're protesting Israel and then they won't really say anything more than that. But both nationwide coverage of this disruption and then even outside, like the Guardian was writing about it and they were writing about Scotiabank and Elbit. And over the next few weeks and months, they kept writing about it as like Scotiabank Elbit in a way that made it so that a lot of people who were not familiar with the investment, even just outside of the arts and culture sector, were suddenly aware of this. Um, and in response, a group called Canlit Responds put together authors uh, to speak in solidarity with the arrestees. And then in January of 2024, a group of us realized this was a bit of an opportunity. And, um, I'm sure all of you are aware that there are so many targets when like thinking about this and thinking about the complicity and participation that Canadian institutions have in the genocide. um, and it's almost like there's so many that our organizing can feel very scattered. Like there's so many targets, it's hard to really like focus on one and build momentum. But we realized that Scotiabank could be one because at the time they were really positioned as the arts bank. We call it art washing. There's a lot of like people talk about pink washing and green washing, and art washing is a way that um, companies will use art sponsorships as a way to obscure, shady investments. And Scotiabank at the time was a big sponsor not only of the Giller Prize, but other literary awards, um, other arts festivals, and other film festivals. And we kind of realized that if we all focus our energy as the culture sector on this like single target, even as multiple groups working in multiple industries, um, we'll actually be able to like get quite a bit of momentum. And in a way, their own sponsorship was kind of a map we could weaponize against them. I always sort of think of it as like they had a festival circuit of certain arts awards and festivals and events that they had sponsored like throughout the year. And that is like a roadmap for our own arc of escalation, where we can set up a narrative at the beginning of the year and escalate and escalate and escalate to the end of the year. And that's kind of how it played out, because after we launched initially, there was the Hot Docs Film Festival, which at the time had Scotiabank as a sponsor. Um, and we kind of realized like, look, we're just starting out. We haven't built enough power to call for a boycott of hot docs and get film workers to pull out. Like we haven't like really built that yet. So what we did instead was have 11 days of counter programming of hot docs with like their own film festivals, 11 days. So we did 11 days of counter programming, and that included protests and disruption. That also included our own film screenings of Palestinian films, and also included panel discussions about organizing, where people could talk to other organizers, people could organize like with the culture sector, like amongst each other. Rachel very generously participated in some of that programming. And as the year progressed, we took it to the Museum of Contemporary Art, which had Fridays sponsored by Scotiabank. We also took it to the Scotiabank Photography Prize, both last year and this year, obviously sponsored by Scotiabank. This Contact Photography Festival, which last year was its final year as a sponsor, and all of that leading up to the 1-year anniversary of that first Giller disruption. And I kind of talked about this arc of escalation, and at the beginning of the year, we hadn't really like built up art workers to like call for a picket line. But as the year progressed, we the work around the Giller and sort of the subgroup within the No Arms campaign, Can Let Respond specifically, was doing all of this narrative work around Scotiabank and the Giller Prize. The Giller itself as an institution also was responding in a way that was like, lashing out, like displaying sort of anti-Palestinian rhetoric. And mid-year, we were able to get Giller Prize eligible authors to withdraw and boycott the Giller under the condition that the Giller Prize, the boycott will last until the Giller Prize drops. Scotiabank is a sponsor, and then also the Israeli Foundation and Indigo Books, which are also complicit in the genocide and the occupation and displacement of Palestinians. By fall, that boycott had expanded past just 2024 eligible authors to all authors as like a standing boycott, and all book workers, and lasted until and at the anniversary of the gala, we had a very large picket line outside of the prize itself, and that included a picket line and also included our own counter festival where different authors who would normally be inside a literary awards show like that were actually out on the streets, like directly outside the hotel, with the lines drawn, reading from Palestinian poetry. And those were also events that were happening worldwide because, a lot of this ended up happening in Toronto because it's just like the nature of a lot of culture sector stuff. Toronto is like a flashpoint for that sort of thing. But at this point, our work had kind of expanded and, obviously the literary Hamlet world exists all sorts of provinces, like every province, and that counter programming, those readings were happening across Canada in like multiple different cities. Since then, we've had some partial wins, and we've also had some like ambiguous developments where some of the partial wins have included a big one, which is that the Giller Prize has dropped Scotiabank as a sponsor. And that doesn't mean the Giller boycott is over because it's only one of the three conditions, but it's 1 out of 3 down. So that was a very big one. And it took a lot of doing because the Giller was trying very hard to ride that out. It of course means that while we're still organizing around the Giller with these other investments, the Giller is no longer a lever we can pull against Scotiabank. I talked about like the way we try to weaponize these stages back at the sponsors. Our end goal isn't just an arts world free of quote unquote complicity. We want to actually like hit these sponsors where it hurts. So it's something that we count as a big win, but we also are aware of like, okay, what are the other angles we as art workers have in our industry to hit a target like Scotiabank? And then I'll sort of get into this when talking a bit about like the larger context of Scotiabank's investment in Elbit, but Scotiabank is no longer a funder of the Contact Photography Festival and no longer a funder of Hot Docs. They explicitly pulled from Contact because they're just pulling from art sponsorships. And Hot Docs is unclear, but that might also be the case of like why that relationship ended as well. Which kind of like maybe brings me to just I'm also going to just talk about maybe I'll stop sharing screen and talk just a little bit of some of the larger context with the Scotia investment and where we are now, because we've had some of these wins that were talked about, and at the beginning of 2024, that 500 million stake became 1/5 of what it used to be, which was like a very big win and was the result of all of this hard work and momentum that was built across the country and all of these different industries and types of organizing and all these different tactics. And clearly the bank now feels that it's maybe like safe or safer to increase their stake, because as we found at the beginning of this year, they did quietly increase their stake in Elbit Systems, and they're still not anywhere close to what they used to be. They, at the beginning of last year, they were the largest foreign shareholder. At the end of last year, they were not the largest foreign shareholder. That is still the case, but they increased their stake by 25% worth of shares, up to, I believe, 180 million, going from something like, I think, 113 million to 180 million. In the quarter since, we found out the amount of shares they have has remained the same, about like 700,000 or something like that. But as was explained, Elbit is more profitable. So even though they didn't increase the number of shares they have, the value of those shares has increased pretty substantially from $180 million worth to $270 million worth, because Elbit is making more money. The Genocide is very profitable to these companies. So we've had these wins, and now Scotiabank, like a lot of other Canadian institutions, believes it can ride out some of these protests and ride out some of the controversy. And I think the day of action is a good kind of opening salvo to reaffirm a commitment to saying, like, no, like, that is not going to happen. Last year, this investment was a liability. It was actually like a PR nightmare. And that was a little bit why Scotiabank was an attractive target. All banks are complicit in the genocide. All banks have even shares in Elbit Systems, but Scotiabank has 60 times more, even post-divestment, 60 times more money in Elbit than its closest Canadian competitor. It is so over-indexed in Elbit and has been uniquely bad at responding to criticism. Their PR team has like really not done a very good job of handling it, versus even say like RBC, which has weathered Leonardo DiCaprio and Mark Ruffalo coming out and denouncing it. Like Scotiabank does not have that polish. So thinking through, like, you know, I'll sort of throw it back over to Rachel. Like, I think it's now a good time to think through, like, this day of action kicks off a new way of thinking around tactics against Scotiabank and thinking where our leverage is. I mentioned how Scotiabank is voluntarily leaving some art sector sponsorships. That is the case with all corporate sponsors, because they've determined that arts sponsorships don't really give the same PR payout and don't give much data payout that sports sponsorships, for instance, do, and sponsoring sort of like different types of charities, a lot of sort of like new business charities. So if they're pulling out of the arts, that doesn't mean that the arts doesn't have any levers to pull against them, but it also means we have to think through, like, what does it mean if they're moving a lot of their investments into sports? What does it mean if they're moving a lot of investments into the NGO world? And what are other levers we can pull? Because yeah, like we had a lot of wins last year, a lot of momentum this year. We shouldn't feel demoralized that Scotiabank now thinks it's like kind of safer to come out of its shell. So yeah, I'll stop talking now and I'll throw it back to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. I mean, yeah, and then to kind of recap on some of those numbers. So I mean, there had been this year of steady divestments in response to the incredible organizing across the country, whereas Scotiabank has started 2024, as Elbit's largest foreign shareholder, like largest in the world outside of Israel. Like Scotiabank was the largest foreign investor in Elbit. By the summer of 2024, their stake had been cut down to a fifth of what it had been as a result of our pressure, our collective pressure across the country. And like Elbit, as I think Dov maybe showed a quick glimpse of, Elbit Systems' own CEO credited us for that divestment. But as Michael mentioned, more recently, in the last 2 quarters, what we're seeing is that they're quietly sneaking back up their stake in Elbit Systems, now up 25% from the very, very low that it was at. And you'll see kind of different dollar figures in different places. And as Michael mentioned, if you're looking at the dollar value of their investments, that's looking at Elbit's value that has been going up and up. Versus if we're looking at the total number of shares that Scotiabank has, that is where we're really tracking, have they bought more? Are they becoming more and more invested in Elbit, or are they decreasing their investment by selling their shares? So we are right now trying to catch them. We are seeing this brand new start of a little trend up towards reinvestment. And this is us right now gathering to nip this in the bud, to say, hell no. We see what you're doing. We're not going to let you start quietly reinvesting in Elbit and think that we won't notice. And we're not going to sit on our laurels after these various big wins that our movement has had around this divestment. So hence us coming together today to figure out what's next. So this is a sort of new phase, bringing together, and I want to say not only bringing together the groups that we've heard from so far, so not only us at World Beyond War, or Juicy No Genocide, who I mentioned, or No Arms in the Arts, or Just Peace Advocates, who I saw got a shout out in the chat for their incredible work tracking banks' investments, and they just released a new report today on Canadian banks' investments that we'll link to later. Not just those groups, but this is also an effort coming together of the Palestinian Youth Movement, of Independent Jewish Voices, Al-Auda, Surge, and other groups across the country. We're unifying at this moment to really force this divestment that we were well on the way to achieving, and we need to make sure it becomes complete. They need to fully divest. So our next step, our first next step, it won't be the last one, but the first step that we're all going to take together is with a day of action on June 14th. This is publicly announced. This is not a sneaky secret action. This is an event. This is an action that we are going to give Scotiabank a very, very bad day. We are going to disrupt their business as much as possible at as many branches as possible across the country. I took a quick look at the registration for this event, for this meeting tonight, and a lot of folks sent their regrets and said they couldn't wait for the recordings, but of the folks who said they could show up, we had people registered at every single province and territory across the country. We have incredible geographic spread in our movement, which means that we can really show up at Scotiabank branches everywhere on this day, and give them a heads up that, hey, we see what you're doing and we're not going to let you get away with it. Put them on the defensive. So this is, I'm going to go over kind of the rough game plan, and then I'm going to, as promised at the end, create a little bit of space for some Q&A with our speakers and with some of you. So the game plan, first of all, I would suggest assembling a team. So this can be your group that you already have been doing lots of organizing with, or this could be a new crew. Think about who might want to be involved in this, and whether it becomes a big group of organizers or whether it's just you and a few buddies will influence then what kind of action you plan. This day is about breadth and impact by all doing things together at many, 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 many branches across the country. Not every action has to be huge. And if what you can do is something smaller with a handful of people, do that. Once you've got a little bit of a crew, pick a location. There are Scotiabank branches all across the country. June 14th is a Saturday, so try and pick, you should pick a location that is open on Saturday. Most of them are, but double check that and give it a visit on a Saturday and see what that location is like. When is it busy? What's the vibe like? What's the space like? Is there construction? Are there a bunch of tellers, or is it just the ATMs that are there? And then fill out the form on the site at scotiabankfundsgenocide.ca. There's a button, Adopt a Branch. That's how you can register it on the map. We are hoping to have a map that is absolutely filled of hundreds of dots all across the country. It should look like their map on their website of where the Scotiabank branches are, except it's going to be where all the protests are going to be on that day. Then you want to be designing your action. This is a choose your own adventure kind of day. So there are many options available to you. You can do, and there's been incredible examples over the past year and a half of types of protests that have happened in this country. Of course, some actions will look like people doing things outside of the branch. This might look like picketing. I've seen some great, very sneaky picketing where people have their flyers and they look just like the people who are giving out promotions. They say Scotiabank promotion and they hand out their flyers. That's a kind of low-key way to do picketing. Of course, another outside action could be a very noisy, beautifully colorful protest that no one on the street can miss, and you're doing that right in front of the branch. These are just some examples. Of course, you can also do an action inside the bank branch. This can look any number of ways. We've seen sit-ins that are very noisy and that are chanting. We've seen silent die-ins where people are illustrating like the violence that have happened, in some cases with their bodies, taking up lots and lots of space on the ground. I've seen actions over the past year. Obviously, I'm not giving anyone any advice, but I've seen beautiful actions that have involved red paint. I've seen beautiful stickering actions. I've seen folks who have played the sounds of Elbit's weapons and drones inside small spaces quite loudly. I've also seen silent candlelit vigils. I think there are many, 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 many options here. And the goal is really to disrupt their business as much as possible at as many branches as possible. And disruption, of course, can certainly look like getting that branch shut down for the day, but it can also look like just turning off customers who are maybe newly horrified to learn of Scotia's investments that they didn't know about, or are simply not thrilled with the idea of having to deal with a protest while they're just trying to go to a branch to get their money on a Saturday morning. There's lots of different types of disruption. Of course, it's important to consider carefully what risk your group is comfortable taking on. Actions where you're not blocking people from entering and you're maybe outside on public property tend to be lower risk actions, a lower risk of police response and a lower risk of being arrested than actions where one is inside a building and refusing to leave when police have asked you to leave, or actions that leave a mark on a property, whether through stickers or paint or whatever. This is not legal advice. I'm obviously not giving that at this time, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's really important to just consider carefully what kind of risk your group is planning and be intentional about that up front. And that will really connect to considering whether this is an action that you want to have be announced ahead of time publicly, like, hey, we're protesting at this branch at this time. Everyone come. It's a Saturday afternoon. Maybe you'll draw a big crowd, and that can be really powerful. Or, and then we'd put it on our map and we'd send it out on our email list, etc. Or whether some actions maybe are secret and private, and you're going to communicate in confidence with the people that you're inviting, and you're relying on an element of surprise, and you don't want it publicly announced. That's fine too. I will say a fun thing that can happen if you announce your action publicly is that the branch might preemptively close, in which case you've done some excellent work of shutting down access to that bank for the day. These are, I'm just sort of throwing some ideas out there, but really I think the sky is the limit. Even if your action is somewhat secret, even if you don't, I'll say this, even if you don't want your action put publicly on a map, if you're able to register the action with our confidential form on our site, on the Scotiabank Funds Genocide site, that helps us to map out where there are big gaps, where people are doing what, and there's a space on that form to indicate whether your action should be publicly announced or not. Yeah, once again, this day of action is only the first next step. From here, we know we're going to need to keep ramping up the pressure more. But first, I'm really excited with all of you and with many more comrades across the country to give Scotiabank a very bad day on June 14th. So now let's open it up to a short Q&A period. I know that folks have been putting some questions in the chat. If folks have more, they can pop them there. If someone would really rather raise their hand and speak out loud, we can try to accommodate that as well. And first, over to you, Dev.
Yeah, I think I want to jump in and just say a few words about some of the questions I see on the chat already. There are always questions about how divestment actually works. And there are these ideas that we really want to have the power to punish those companies. Yes, we really want to harm Elbit's share price. We want to reach and actually have an impact on their bottom line. And it's so frustrating to realize that divestment usually doesn't do that. And it really doesn't. So several people said that in the chat, and they are correct. Also, it doesn't always make sense to target the largest shareholder or the worst bank. You know, it doesn't work that way. The way divestment works is by creating a new standard for responsible investors. And it does that by winning. We need to win many campaigns. We need to have more and more public funds announce that they would not invest in these companies. We need to have more and more cities and governments divest from them. We want to have more and more banks divest from them. So in order to reach that state, when you create a new norm, we need to win campaigns. And the Scotiabank campaign has had a partial win. They actually sold most of their shares, like 3/4 of their shares at some point, and did it very quickly as a response to your pressure. So we have to keep at it. I think we have to keep at it and make them divest completely, because you need the win in order to move on to the next target. And why is it important to create that new standard or new norm? Because maybe it will also have financial impacts, because when it becomes a norm and it becomes much bigger, but also because it has a huge impact on others. Other companies will not want to be on the same list with the companies that we target for divestment. It's a very short list of companies we target for divestment. So companies we already see that, by the way. They are hiding their involvement. When I looked today on Elbit Systems website to see the list of their 10 largest investors, that was always there, and Scotiabank, by the way, was one of them. I couldn't find the list. They don't publish it anymore. So it's small, but hey, wherever we can make some kind of impact, we are required to do so. And it seems like this campaign is working. So let's win it.
Can I add another comment there? Thank you so much. That was such a clear explanation of exactly why these boycotts are important. I think I'll add two other pieces. One of them is that Israel specifically, but maybe even this entire enterprise of imperialism generally, it depends on a tremendous amount of legitimacy. And that legitimacy is given in a lot of ways subconsciously. Like we just legitimize all these systems through the various things that we do. And so when there is a specific and clear attempt to delegitimize a particular relationship, like maybe banks shouldn't be investing in weapons companies, even if they are profitable. I mean, of course, we know that weapons companies profit during war. There's no secret there. I know exactly why those stocks are going up, but maybe we shouldn't be a part of that. And so that delegitimization is important. And the other thing too is all of these companies have people who work there, and those people are themselves going to lose morale if we continue these events. So they're not immune to the news. Nobody wants to work for the evil company. Think, for example, of people who are working at Tesla right now, or people who work at Twitter or X right now. When these people get demoralized, they start to leave the company and make it less profitable, which ultimately is one of the big goals here.
All right, I'm not seeing questions at this point that are kind of on a sort of new topic, but what I am seeing is some really great organizing happening in the chat and folks connecting with each other. I'd love to see that. I think my suggestion in terms of folks looking for other local people near them is to put is when you reach out, or when you reach out to other groups or in other chats or whatever that you're in, to give kind of a concrete, like, hey, I'm looking for other folks to co-organize a Scotiabank action at this branch or at a Scotiabank in this neighborhood on this day, based on the call out on this site. Who wants to join me? I think that a lot of people are desperately looking for something that they can do right now, and having kind of a clear call to action, and to know that what they're doing is part of something that people all across the country are doing on the same Saturday all together, I think will be helpful. I think all of the groups involved in this are going to be kind of blasting out information on this day of action over the next little bit. And I think many, many more people will be hearing about it and will be wanting to organize together. Also seeing in the chat suggestions about different ways of organizing, and what about campaigns about this, and what about organizing in solidarity with Indigenous folks? And I think the answer is yes, 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 yes. We need to be doing all of the different things. This is one campaign, as I mentioned at the beginning. Like when I said nothing we can do is enough, maybe that can feel demoralizing, but also I think that sometimes we're looking for what is the everything that we can do. And there's no one thing that is everything. Nothing is enough. And therefore, we do everything that we can. And this is one important way that we can pull Canadian money away from, frankly, one of the most evil corporations on the planet. Certainly one of the companies that is most complicit in the genocide in Gaza right now. And I think this is an important way that we can come together. And just big appreciation to all of you. We're more than 100 people here. I know it's quite late at night, especially on the East Coast, and to come together and build this campaign in this way, I think is such a powerful thing for us to be doing right now. So I'm going to wrap it up there. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the links that we've shared today, as well as the recording of this to share with others. I'll ask everyone to take a minute to share the Scotiabank Funds Genocide website everywhere so everyone knows about this next phase of the campaign and knows about the day of action. Yeah, and to continue to show up and to come together and to take care of each other at this extremely horrifying time to be a human in the world. And I think the way that we get through it is through things like this and through coming together in resistance. So thank you all so much. Thank you so much to our incredible speakers tonight and to all of you for everything that you do. Take care.